Hey, welcome back to the podcast, Decade of Disruption. And of course, you guys know we talk about things that really are disrupting our entire society. And food often is one of the leading catalysts of where disruption begins. With me today, I have the CEO of a company called New Age Meats, Brian Spears. Great to have you on the show, man.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Yeah. So, Brian, let's go right into New Age Meats. I've kind of tracked the cellular agriculture industry for the past few years. Had a chance to kind of see and talk with the Memphis Meats guys. So I'm curious about what you guys are doing there at New Age. Tell me a little about you.
Sure. So we make meat without slaughter. So it's the real meat that we've been eating all our lives. We just make it in an entirely better way. And we can, our first product is going to be sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, your first product.
Sure, yeah. So we target a blended product for our first product. The idea being that the cultivated meat itself, it is the real deal. It's real meat. It's real animal muscle and cell fat and connective tissue. As you probably know, it is right now expensive to make and difficult to scale. And so instead of coming to market with a fully cultivated meat product, we instead use our cells as functional ingredients to, in our case, a blended sausage. So we blend with plant and fungal ingredients in order to make a sausage, which is then much better than anything on the plant-based side, but also much less expensive and easier to scale than anything on the pure cultivated side.
Yeah. So a hybrid of sort, clone style technology, that's a good approach. I like that. So what was the direction? Obviously, your background, I got a chance to talk with you. Did you say industrial engineering was your background?
Yeah, so academic background is chemical engineering, and then my industry experience is in research and industrial automation. So essentially the pipeline from research into development into production.
Right. Right. I think a lot of times when, for our listeners, one of the, some of the challenges I think they look at, especially when you kind of drop into the category of food, because there's a lot of innovation happening now, obviously with plant-based, you look at where Impossible and also with Beyond Meat, where they're going and how the consumer is somewhat adopting, but also at the same time, we just ran a poll that had almost 3,000 respondents talk about it, and we were asking them, would plant-based burgers replace your beef burgers this summer? And it was a resounding no. So still a very small amount of the population is going the route of plant-based. It is very clear that meat is still king, so to speak. So I'm kind of curious, when you look at the challenge that cellular agriculture represents, because obviously you're essentially growing from a cell base into a product that you can use into a consumption element or a vehicle. Curious, how long does it take a cell-based, and how do you start the process to actually get product out of that? What's the cycle of life there?
Sure. So the time frame it takes, it's really it's a math problem. So you have these cultivators that are kind of just like big, think of a beer brewery. So if you go to your local microbrew, you may see these big steel vats, steel containers. It looks like that. So inside of those, you have cells. And as I said, kind of the math problem is you have a certain number of cells that you start with, and they follow this predictable growth curve. And so you just need to decide how much you want, and you just stop the multiplication process at that time. And then they'll differentiate into muscle or fat, connective tissue, whatever you want. So it really just depends on what you started with. So we do have a continuous process. So the cells are kind of continuously growing and multiplying, and then you harvest continuously. So that's the idea.
Yeah. What do you feed this stuff? I mean, where are the nutrients coming from? How does that cycle work with being able to inject it into a lab-grown meat to get it out to a point where it actually tastes like a beef patty or a sausage patty?
Sure, yeah. So the cells, they come directly from the animal. And so when you take cells from an animal, they're kind of out of their element and they want to die. So you have to feed them. So our cells run on glucose, for instance, so sugar. So you'll feed them glucose, but then also amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. So those are kind of the main constituents, but they also need certain minerals and salts and also certain signaling proteins. So in our body and in an animal's body, we have certain proteins that go around telling our cells what to do. And if you take cells out of an animal, then there aren't those proteins. So you have to add those proteins in so that it tells
Yeah.
the cells to multiply or then to differentiate, that type of thing.
So how do you overcome, the issue of a natural raised, let's just stay in the beef category for a second, a naturally raised, beef for production animal that is dealing with different kinds of attributes in their life that creates muscle tissue, fat tissue, all again based on their environment raising them, what they're exposed to for eating, et cetera. How does that, or how is that replicated or at least mimicked in the process of growing it through a lab environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I come from outside the industry. So when I came in, I knew that there was a field of meat science, but only now do I fully appreciate that it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, frankly,
Yeah.
meat worldwide. And so you have tons of people who are making their livelihood on just studying meat and studying essentially, as you know, the diet goes into an animal, how the animal is raised, what types of
Right.
antibiotics and growth hormones, for instance, you put into an animal, and then also understanding what meat is at a cellular level. So what are the constituents that go in? So when an animal eats the meat, or sorry, eats their meal, soy or corn or grass or whatever, when it gets digested, goes through the liver and then goes to the bloodstream and and then is available to the cells. What are those things? What are the cells
Right.
taking in? And then what do they look like inside of an animal? And then what are the sensory characteristics that then they deliver to us, the food sensory characteristics? So when you're asking, well, how do we mimic that? We have to study that. So that's something that meat scientists are studying, but there's also something that we're studying in our labs.
Yeah. So in terms of scalability, because that's usually the hindering factor, that at least everybody I've talked to in the cellular agriculture industry, that's been the number one thing, is getting to scale. And you guys have kind of hacked it a little bit in the sense of you're using a blend. But do you see this as, is it just a technology problem that we're dealing with right now, that we just don't have enough advancements there to be able to get to scale on production and actually produce millions of pounds of burger or chicken or fish or whatever it might be in the future?
So it's shifting more from a science problem to an engineering problem. So my background is engineering, and I work with the scientists. So they're kind of making the new they're figuring out the new research, and then we take that and we move it into, we'll say, the bioengineering side, so the bioprocess.
Right.
And so, as you're asking, that's the scale portion. So the limiting factor is the biggest thing would be that the industry of bioprocess, so essentially making mammalian cells, mammal cells at large scale, it's kind of catered to a different industry. It's catered to pharma. So the product of that industry is to make proteins, for instance, that then go in a human's body in order for therapeutics to go make them well. And
Right.
and so that system is kind of not designed to do what we want it to do. And so
Yeah.
we can start there, but then we can make progressive improvements in order to make the cultivators better, in order to understand what to feed the cells better, in order to understand how to make a sustainable closed loop system. So that's all advancing, at our workplace and then other companies as well.
Interesting. So, Brian, where is the leading science occurring right now? Does the U.S. kind of have the lead position on it, or is there some interesting things? I've seen some stuff out of Europe. I've also seen some programs in Asia that are kind of going in this direction. Who do you feel like has, kind of like when you look at alternative energy, who's got the edge right now in terms of this being reality?
It's a good question. So you can kind of think of a lot of research that is open source, that's kind of like an academic, openly available. That's very much on we'll say the biology side, like the primary biology. So what do you do with the cells? What do you feed the cells? How do you make a cell line? So things like that.
Yeah.
There is a whole nother set of knowledge in the bioprocess space, which typically comes from industry. So how do you go and make this a large scale? What types of reactors are you using? What types of flow and what types of ingredients do you put in order to make that run well? So that's not as open source. So your question is like, where's the best place to do the science? It's the science and the engineering. So on the science side, there's a lot of open source science that's happening all over the world. And then there are certain governments that are really incentivized to support the science and the companies, which are doing more of the engineering. So
Right.
Israel's doing a great job. The Netherlands is doing a great job. Singapore is doing pretty well. So there's investment from countries like Japan. So the U.S. is slowly coming to, as far as a governmental level,
Hmm.
is on the regulatory side, they're actually moving quite quickly. On
Right.
the grant side, not as much. So a lot of the money is coming from private investment. So we're a
Yeah.
venture-backed company, venture capital-backed company, and so for better for worse, there's a lot of investment, or there's a lot of money there, and so that's primarily how our company and the companies like us are funded.
Do you see this as something that eventually, if you look at companies like the Tysons of the worlds, you can even go into Smithfield Companies, which is a Chinese owned company. A lot of people don't know that. Where do you see the future for those types of companies going in? Because in many cases, you could potentially retool some of their facilities, I'm assuming, for actually engineering at scale if you've got a base bulk product available. Do you see that eventually coming into the marketplace where regular beef manufacturers start to shift into cellular agriculture?
Sure, yeah. So I think a lot of people looking from the outside see that our technology, the cultivated meat technology, or cellular agriculture, that we're going to disrupt and destroy these big Tysons or Cargills, JBS, as you mentioned. And the fact is that they see themselves as meat companies, protein companies,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they deliver the meat to the end user. So they package it, they distribute it, they market it, brand it, etc. Upstream of that, they use their technology or animals, but they can switch
Yeah.
that. They can switch that
Yeah.
to the cellular agriculture, as you note, and then
Right.
they're still delivering the downstream value to their customers. So for them, they're not married to the idea of using animals to go and create the meat. They know they can create it through the cellular agriculture, and if it's a better system, which for them
Yeah.
means it's more efficient, which means it makes them more money, then they're fine with it. They're actually very happy to transition, and you see that already.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, I've often argued that in many cases, a lot of these food suppliers, in fact, are, the food is definitely an element within it, but really what they are is distribution companies and also the ability to reach the mass markets. That's kind of their forte, other than obviously they have to manufacture it. But in most cases, they could shift into some cycles such as plant-based, and in this case, cellular-based technology, which I think is going to be a very intriguing thing to watch over this next decade to really see how the evolution occurs. Let's talk a little about the sustainability of this process versus what it takes to grow a cow, or if you look and talk to a lot of the West Texas ranchers, this process is essentially going to take away eventually the farming element, which then changes the industry, because now you're dealing with obviously things that are much more sustainably, I guess, impressed upon in terms of the industry, everything from water consumption to land consumption, et cetera. How does sustainability roll up into this? And have you guys looked at any math or any kind of forecast that potentially could say, hey, this is where it could really reduce carbon footprints, and maybe even going as far out as our whole ecological system here on Earth? Where does that go from here? That's a big question.
Absolutely. That's actually the biggest reason that I'm in this industry. So when I actually left my previous industry and said, okay, there's a problem with climate change, with environmental destruction, and we only have this one Earth, and we're growing as a population, and we're using a lot more of the resources, and we're
Right.
outputting a lot of, for instance, greenhouse gases that are causing environmental destruction. And I wouldn't be in this industry if I didn't think it was dramatically better for the planet than the existing industry. And so and we can kind of break down the impact of meat, for instance, into kind of four broad categories, which would be the land use, water use, direct greenhouse gas emissions, and then energy usage. And so
Sure.
on all of those factors, on all those fronts, we are better than the existing industry. Now, there are a variety of studies that look at this. There are some more they're called them life cycle analyses, which are simply just looking at all the inputs and all the outputs. And it is difficult at this point to get a really solid life cycle analysis because we aren't to production yet. So once we have
Right.
a production facility, then we can actually do a really good life cycle analysis. At this point,
Hmm.
when we're still in the R&D phase, it's harder to say that. But there are some things that are kind of that show up as kind of obvious. Is that because we don't have animals that graze, as you note, then they won't need the land. So we can
Yeah.
actually just have a facility where all of the cultivation happens, and that could even be vertical if we want. And so we'll use 99% less land, and that's kind of a gimme. It's really
Right.
easy. Same thing on the water usage as well. When you're feeding animals, then especially on the cow side, then they'll go for
Yeah.
several months to year and a half, where they're moving around, they're mooing, they're blinking, they're using energy. So they're
Yeah.
using the food that they're eating, but also the water in order to go and do things that we don't consume. So an animal actually
Right.
living is, you can think of that as wasted calories. And so
Yeah.
we don't waste calories like that. So we can actually make the whole process much more efficient, including the water. So water usage is lower. Um, direct greenhouse gas emissions would be lower as well. So that would be something like methane. So
Yeah.
CH4 would be from cows burping. So if you don't have burping cows, then you don't create that methane. And then the energy usage as well is much lower. And so, but the energy usage also just depends on where you get the energy. So how much that affects the environment. So if you
Yeah.
have a existing like a fossil fuel based energy source, then it will be more environmentally impactful than something that's more renewable. So in the
Yeah.
future, as our whole ecosystem transitions to more renewable energy sources, then our system will become increasingly green, whereas the existing agriculture system will not. It will not be able to, because they have these direct greenhouse gas emissions from the methane, as I mentioned, also nitrous oxide. So it's on every front, our product is dramatically more sustainable.
Yeah. I'm surprised that someone like an Elon Musk has not really, when you look at what he's doing in terms of alternative energy, especially around the panel plants that they're needing, obviously, to fuel their whole manufacturing process for both cars and also their efforts in space, that food would be a natural element for someone like a Tesla or companies like that to get into some sort of alternative energy engines for companies that are moving in this direction, which I think as you guys get to scale and get to manufacturing levels, obviously the amount of power needed for doing this type of work is probably going to be pretty immense, I would assume, based on what you're laying out here. Let's talk about distribution. And you've talked a little bit about the hybrid product, that it's the quality of it when it's fused with maybe some plant-based product, that you get that meat-like texture, you get that satisfaction if you're a consumer eating that. Do you feel like that's the direction we will see, is meat infused or blended plant-based as the leading product that comes out of all this new tech coming down the pipe? Because if you look at someone like a Beyond Meat, they're more, it's more of I won't call it a CPG type product, but it is a chemically enhanced plant-based product versus something like a just general black bean burger. So do you see this coming in as kind of a hybrid of using, true, vegan-based components and then animal-based cellular agriculture to blend that in and become kind of the new meat of the world? Because that's one thing that people have been saying as we talk about this, is that it may not necessarily be the plant-based and it may not necessarily be the cellular agriculture-based. We may see something come out of the industry that's completely new.
I think you're entirely right. And in our, the way we approach it, New Age Meats, it's kind of obvious that that it has to be this blended product.
Yeah.
And there are a few ways to look at it. One is, I think as you mentioned, the Beyonds and Impossibles, I eat their products. I think they're great. I think they taste pretty good. So there's a taste element. There's also a texture element. So you can kind of divide sensory into taste, texture, appearance, aroma. And so on all of these, you get pretty good taste. The texture is they're working on it. I'll say that.
Yeah.
So there are,
Yeah.
but the reason that's difficult to do is because they have this really difficult task of using entirely plants to go make
Right.
a meat product. And so their toolkit is all plants. And so they have to fundamentally change these plants by adding a bunch of things and doing things like extrusion, high pressure, high temperature extrusion to change the proteins around, to give them more of a meat fibers texture rather than the plant texture. So in all those cases, again, you have this toolkit, which is going back to first principles, plants going to animals. And that's hard. That's a very difficult transition. So essentially, we come from a different angle. We say, hey, what if you could just take the actual animal product that we make through the cellular agriculture without live animals, and you can then use them for their innate sensory capabilities. So with the thing around the texture and the taste, and then you blend that with all of the plant-based and fungal side, which then can provide things like some of these other textural and taste components, which can augment and make the whole product better and also drop the cost down. So we essentially are able to make up for what they lack with our real meat product. And we can do that in a much more affordable way, in a way that's actually a greater production capacity.
So when you look, the aspect of if you look at manufacturing, and I look kind of forward 10 years, cellular agriculture is most likely going to be a real thing. We're going to see a lot of facilities that are moving in that direction. You mentioned open source a little bit there. Is this a product or a process that can be affected much like what GMO was done with Monsanto in terms of seed cultivation, things of that, when you go that direction? Is this a technology that anyone owns right now? Anybody that says, hey, we've got essentially a patent on this process? Or is this open source enough to where any company with the right kind of financing and funding and understanding could go out and do this?
Well, it's definitely not open enough that anybody could come in and do that. So as I go back to the question earlier around where in the world is the best research going on, and kind of what I was saying is in the U.S. we have a lot of venture-backed capital, whereas some other countries may have more direct government investment. And in a lot of cases, the direct government investment can be in the individual companies, but also in open research. So if you invest in open research, then you get open research in a lot of cases, or you get a lot of openly available knowledge. But if you invest in private companies, you get a lot of closed IP. So from a capital market perspective, you can get a lot of cases a lot more money from the private market. So in our case, as a company, and then the other companies in our space, we have a lot of IP tied up in kind of everything I've mentioned this whole interview. Is if our investors didn't think that there was something special that we were able to gain from the dollars that they've invested, then they wouldn't keep investing. And so, there aren't. I wouldn't say it's an easy thing right now for a company to just jump in and take the existing pieces and make the meat. They have to have gone through the process. We've been at it for about 2.5 years, and we have some significant IP in that regard.
Where do you think the advances will be made in the next 5 years that would differentiate companies going forward? Do you think it's going to be in the processing side or in actually the lab side in terms of growing the product at scale?
We see companies kind of focusing on either or both sides. I think most companies tend to start with scientists who are familiar with the bench scale. So I say like the scientific bench, which tend to be more focused on the cell lines, the cell culture media. And then they rely on partners down the road to do the engineering side. And those can be, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the existing bioengineering industry, or they can be some of the new players popping up that are making new technology that are specifically designed for our industry, for our cells, for our applications. And so I see IP showing up in both cases. We, as a company, so my background, as I mentioned, chemical engineering and then research in industrial automation. And so we have taken the whole pipeline view from the beginning. So we've focused on the biology and the bioengineering side. Whereas I mentioned a lot of companies just focus on the biology side. So we have then IP on both sides.
Interesting. All right, last question for you here before I let you go. And that's the consumer aspect of it. If you look at, obviously, the next phase for something like this is product acceptance in the consumer markets. being able to get out at scale in terms of distribution, all that good stuff. But really, it's going to boil down to the consumer saying, I'm willing to go this direction, much like they've chosen with some of the plant-based products that, for obvious reasons, for the companies, even though there's only a handful of them that are doing it right now. Do you think the consumer is going to accept this as a new norm for animal-based proteins? Do you feel there's enough pressure on our society to get away from animal harvesting and moving into this for them to say, yeah, we're going to go that direction and that's just going to be the way it is?
Well, I would, implicit in the question is that the driver to make people switch is the sustainability factor. And that's actually not how we even approach the question to the consumer. We make tastier, safer, more sustainable meat. So the technology of making meat inside of an animal is thousands of years old, right? So we have this animal, we feed it things and we husband it, we treat it a certain way, and then we take the meat out of the animal and we eat that. And that technology really can't change that much because an animal didn't evolve to give us meat. It evolved to survive and live and to procreate. So we can kind of remove the animal entirely and we can focus on all the way the base level. What are the cells doing that deliver to us the sensory characteristics of food? And we can make that way better. We can make it so much tastier. And then out of the box as a result of our process, we don't have the safety concerns that we're observing right now. So COVID-19, for instance, has kind of really made very obvious the fact that the meat supply system doesn't really work that well and isn't very safe. So one, it makes people sick at the end consumer, but also sick along the pipeline, the people that treat it. So we don't have any of the same types of diseases that would come from, or epidemics, pandemics, that come from the existing animal agriculture system. So when we say, why will people switch? Well, they'll switch because it's better. It's just better meat for them.
Yeah. I think if it gets to that point, hopefully when someone's watching this video podcast 20 years from now, and they're looking back at us saying, God, those Neanderthals, just did not figure this out in time. It'll be interesting to see kind of the evolution of where this is going to be going. Hey, Brian, it's been great having you on the show. Thank you so much for stopping in.
Thanks so much. I appreciate your time. It's been fun.
Yeah. All right. So, hey, thanks for listening in on another great podcast. We love to explore kind of this whole idea of disruption. And that is every market, every industry that you could imagine in the next 10 years are truly at the precipice of being disrupted. It is going to become something to watch. Hopefully, if you're listening to this podcast, whether you're on iTunes or over on Spotify, or maybe you're catching us on YouTube, just subscribe. And then if you have some great ideas, hit me up on Twitter, just at Paul Barron. I'd love to get your ideas on where you think maybe we should cover other topics here on the show and get more decade of disruption. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.